The moment Donald Trump handed Emily Martinez the photograph, the world around them seemed to freeze for just a second, but only for them. Outside the bubble of their realization, the media storm had already begun. The cameras, the flashing lights, the reporters scrambling to get closer. It was a scene of absolute chaos unfolding on the steps of Trump Tower. News anchors spoke urgently into their microphones, trying to piece together what was happening in real time. Who was this homeless veteran? Why had Trump stopped? And most importantly, what did this mean? By now, every major news network had gone live, breaking away from their scheduled programming to cover the unexpected event. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and even international networks like BBC and Al Jazeera were tuned in, broadcasting the developing story to millions. Social media was even faster. Within minutes, Twitter was flooded with clips of the encounter, raw and unedited. Some focused on Trump's expression as he studied Emily. Others zoomed in on her reaction when she looked at the photograph. But the biggest questions on everyone's minds were, who is she, and why does she matter so much to Donald Trump? Speculation ran wild. Hashtag Trump veteran. Mystery shot to the top of Twitter's trending list within 15 minutes, followed by Who is Emily and Trump Tower surprise. Some users praised Trump for acknowledging a homeless veteran, seeing the moment as a rare, unscripted act of humanity. Others immediately assumed it was staged, a carefully orchestrated PR stunt. Convenient timing, one user wrote. Why would Trump, of all people, randomly stop and talk to a homeless person? This smells fishy. Another countered. You can tell by her reaction. This wasn't planned. Something real is happening here. Meanwhile, journalists raced to dig up information about Emily Martinez. Within 20 minutes, someone had found a Department of Defense record confirming that she had served in Afghanistan as a combat medic. A few minutes later, an old VA benefits appeal under her name surfaced online, confirming that she had been discharged and had struggled with PTSD. By the time an independent military news blog tracked down a blurry photograph of her in uniform, standing with her unit in Afghanistan, the internet had already made up its mind. Emily Martinez was real, a real soldier, a real hero, and, somehow, at the center of a moment that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. Fox News commentators immediately seized the narrative, presenting it as proof of the government's failure to care for its veterans. This is exactly what we've been saying for years, one anchor stated. Here's a decorated combat medic, left on the streets, completely abandoned, and it takes Donald Trump, not the Biden administration, not the VA, to recognize her. That says it all. On the other end of the spectrum, progressive voices on MSNBC and Twitter took a different approach, questioning Trump's motives. What's the angle here? A liberal podcast host speculated. This is a man who never does anything without a reason. Why this veteran? Why now? Some argued that Trump had staged the moment as a political maneuver to appeal to veterans in Middle America. Others insisted that the raw emotion in Emily's face, the sheer genuine shock, proved that something much deeper was happening. Meanwhile, TikTok and Instagram exploded with reaction videos. Some former military personnel shared their own struggles with PTSD and homelessness, relating to Emily's journey. Others tried to break down her body language, analyzing whether she seemed cautious, overwhelmed, or relieved. Notice how she grips the strap of her backpack, one body language expert pointed out in a viral TikTok. That's a subconscious self-soothing mechanism. She's on high alert but not aggressive. She doesn't expect kindness. She expects conflict. That tells us a lot about what she's been through. But the biggest revelation was yet to come. Less than an hour after the initial encounter, a military journalist made a shocking discovery, a declassified mission report from Afghanistan detailing a combat medic who saved multiple soldiers during an ambush in 2019. The medic had run through enemy fire, pulled wounded troops from a burning vehicle, and kept one soldier alive by singing to him in Spanish until a medevac arrived. The soldier had survived. The medic had been injured. Her name? Staff Sergeant Emily Martinez. The moment that report hit social media, everything changed. Within minutes, users began connecting the dots. Trump's nephew Mark had served in Afghanistan. He had survived a near-fatal attack. He had often spoken about a combat medic who had saved his life, but whose name he had never known. Could Emily be that medic? The question spread like wildfire. Trump nephew theory began trending globally. News organizations scrambled to verify the connection. Military contacts and veterans chimed in, some confirming that Mark Trump had indeed been in Afghanistan during the time of the attack. Others began posting old messages from Mark's past interviews where he described the woman who had saved him, the one he had never been able to find. If it was true, if Emily Martinez was the medic who had saved Mark Trump's life, then this wasn't just a viral moment. It was history in the making. Emily Martinez had spent the last 3 years wondering if the young soldier she had saved in Afghanistan had survived. She had seen so many wounded, so many faces filled with pain and fear, and she had done everything in her power to keep them alive. But war was cruel. Sometimes, no matter how hard she fought, no matter how many battlefield miracles she performed, the outcome was beyond her control. And yet, here she was, standing in a gleaming penthouse in Trump Tower, staring at the very same soldier she had once pulled from a burning Humvee in the deserts of Afghanistan. Mark Trump. Older now, stronger, but unmistakable, it was him. Emily barely heard the murmurs of Donald Trump and his security team as they stood back, giving the two of them space. She barely noticed the constant hum of helicopters outside, or the faint buzz of her phone, which was still vibrating with messages she hadn't checked. Her world had narrowed to just this moment, just this man. Mark took a hesitant step forward, his expression unreadable at first. Was it disbelief? Was it gratitude? Something deeper? Before his lips pressed together and his eyes filled with emotion. "You're real," he said at last, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I looked for you. For 3 years I looked for you." Emily swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She had spent so much time believing she had been forgotten, believing that the people she had saved had moved on with their lives while she was left to pick up the shattered pieces of her own. But here he was, standing in front of her, proving her wrong. "I didn't know your name," she admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "I didn't know if you made it. After they pulled you out, She exhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay composed. "I tried to find out, but everything happened so fast. And then She hesitated, unsure of how much to say. How do you explain to someone that you went from saving lives to living on the streets? Mark, however, understood, without her having to say it. His gaze flickered over her worn military jacket, the same one she had been wearing when she saved him, now faded from years of hardship. His hands clenched into fists and he shook his head. "You saved my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And while I was figuring out how to live with what happened, you—" His jaw tightened. "You were out there, alone." Emily had spent so long keeping her emotions locked away, buried beneath layers of resilience and survival instinct. But something in Mark's voice cracked through her defenses. She had expected gratitude, maybe even guilt, but not this. Not the raw pain in his eyes, the anger that seemed to be directed not at her, but at the system that had failed her. "I did what I had to do," she said simply, because what else was there to say? She had no regrets about saving him. She would do it again in a heartbeat. That wasn't what hurt. What hurt was everything that came after. "That day," Mark said, stepping closer now, "I remember everything, the explosion, the fire. I remember thinking I wasn't going to make it. And then you." He exhaled a shaky breath, his eyes locked onto hers as if he was still trying to convince himself that this was real. "You were there. You didn't leave me." "Of course I didn't," Emily murmured. "I sang to you," Mark said suddenly, his lips curling into something like a smile, but his voice still heavy with emotion. "That Spanish lullaby, Mi Pequeño Angel. You sang it to me while I was bleeding out." Emily's breath hitched. She hadn't realized he had remembered that part. "My mom used to sing it to me when I was a kid," she admitted. "It helped keep you conscious." "It did," Mark nodded, his voice breaking slightly. "I focused on your voice, on every word. I held onto it. And when I got back home, every time things got bad, every time the nightmares came," he paused, inhaling deeply, "I heard your voice." It kept me going. Emily felt her hands tremble, and she clenched them into fists at her sides. She had spent so long believing that her sacrifices had been forgotten, that she had given everything and been left with nothing. But now, standing here in front of Mark Trump, hearing the weight of his words, she realized something. She hadn't just saved his life that day. She had been with him ever since. She had survived war, homelessness, and a system that had failed her. But this moment, this reunion, was something she had never expected. Mark took another step forward, closing the final bit of distance between them, and before Emily could even process it, he pulled her into a hug, a deep, strong embrace, filled with unspoken gratitude, pain, and relief. For a moment, Emily stiffened. She wasn't used to this anymore, this kind of connection, but then she let herself sink into it, let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as forgotten as she had thought. Behind them, Donald Trump watched the moment unfold, arms crossed, nodding slightly to himself. His security team remained on high alert, but they understood now, this wasn't just a reunion, it was a reckoning. As the two finally pulled apart, Mark exhaled a small, shaky laugh, wiping at his eyes. "You have no idea how many times I've told this story," he admitted. "How many times I've tried to explain what you did for me. But now," he gestured between them, "now people will actually know." Emily arched a brow. "You think people care about an old war story?" "They should," Mark said firmly. "They should know what you did. They should know what happened after." His eyes darkened slightly. "They should know what happens to the heroes they forget." The words hit Emily harder than she expected. Maybe it was because they were true. Maybe it was because she wasn't just a statistic in a VA report or a nameless face in a crowd anymore. She was Emily Martinez, combat medic, survivor. And now, she was seen. Mark inhaled deeply, composing himself, then gave her a knowing look. "You're not going back to that street corner," he said. It wasn't a question. Emily smirked slightly, her old fire flickering back to life. "No, I don't think I am." Mark nodded, satisfied. "Good, because we've got a lot of work to do." And just like that, Emily Martinez's life changed forever. Emily Martinez had spent years believing that her story ended the moment she was discharged, that her purpose had been left behind in the desert sands of Afghanistan, buried under the weight of trauma, bureaucracy, and a system that had failed her. She had convinced herself that survival was enough, that making it through each day, each night, each winter on the streets was a victory in its own right. But now, standing in Trump Tower, looking into the determined eyes of Mark Trump, the very soldier she had saved years ago, she realized something profound. Her mission wasn't over. It was just beginning. Mark's voice was steady, but there was an urgency beneath it, a conviction that made Emily pause. "I didn't just find you to say thank you," he admitted, his hands gripping the table in front of him. "I found you because I need you, because other veterans just like you, need you." Emily's instinct was to deflect, to push back, to remind him that she was still fighting her own battles, that she was still figuring out how to put one foot in front of the other. But then she saw the way he looked at her, not with pity, not with condescension, but with respect. He wasn't offering her charity, he was offering her a mission. Mark turned his laptop screen toward her, and Emily saw a website with a name that made her breath catch in her throat. The Angel Watch Veterans Foundation. "Named after you," Mark said quietly, his gaze locked on hers. "After what you did for me that day? After the song you sang to keep me alive? This isn't just a foundation, Emily. It's a lifeline." Emily stared at the screen, scrolling through the images and mission statements. Immediate mental health care for veterans, emergency housing programs, job placement services, medical assistance without the red tape. "This is real?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. Mark nodded. "It is, and it's growing fast. We've already helped hundreds of veterans, gotten them off the streets, connected them with doctors, made sure they didn't have to wait months for help that should have been there the moment they came home. But we're just getting started." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "I need someone who understands both sides of this. Someone who's been there, someone who knows what it's like to fight for your country and then come home feeling like you've been abandoned. Emily swallowed hard. You think I'm that person? I know you are, Mark said. Because despite everything, despite the hell you've been through, you never stopped being a medic. Even when you had nothing, you were still helping others, the people on the streets, the other homeless vets. You looked out for them, didn't you? Emily didn't answer, but Mark didn't need her to. He already knew. Donald Trump, who had been watching the conversation unfold with the same calculating sharpness that had made him one of the most powerful figures in the world, finally spoke. I've seen a lot of people in my time, he said, his voice even. I've seen fighters, I've seen leaders, and I've seen people who talk a big game but don't back it up. You're the real deal. He gestured toward the laptop. This foundation, it needs someone like you. Someone who's not afraid to get their hands dirty, someone who won't let these politicians sit on their asses while veterans are dying in the streets. Emily looked down at her hands, rough and calloused, hands that had once saved lives and had then struggled to keep her own life intact. The thought of stepping into something bigger, of fighting for others again, it terrified her, but at the same time, it called to her. You're asking me to do something impossible, she said at last, shaking her head. Mark smiled. You ran through gunfire to save me from a burning Humvee, Emily. The impossible is kind of your thing. A chuckle escaped her lips before she could stop it. The first real laugh she had allowed herself in years. She exhaled deeply, the weight of doubt still pressing down on her, but something else was rising to meet it. Purpose. What would you need me to do? She asked. Mark didn't hesitate. Be the face of this. Be the voice for the veterans who can't speak up. You know the system, you know where it's broken. Help us fix it. Emily looked at the laptop again, scrolling through testimonies from veterans who had already been helped, men and women who had been given another chance, who had been seen, heard, and given the dignity they deserved. I don't do politics, she warned. Trump smirked. Then don't. Do the work, let the results speak for themselves. I'll handle the political fights. Emily considered it for a long moment. Could she do this? Could she step back into the world that had let her down so many times? And then she thought about the other veterans she had met on the streets. The ones who didn't have Mark Trump searching for them. The ones who didn't get lucky. She had a chance to change that. To be the medic again. To save lives again. To make sure no one else was forgotten. With a steady breath, she straightened her spine and met Mark's gaze. Okay, she said. I'm in. The relief that flooded Mark's face was almost overwhelming. Trump nodded approvingly. And in that moment, Emily Martinez, a woman who had once believed she had lost everything, had found something she never thought she would again, a mission worth fighting for. The story of Emily Martinez's unexpected encounter with Donald Trump and the revelation of her heroic past spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. Within hours, news stations had picked up the footage, and social media was flooded with posts dissecting every moment. The image of Trump breaking protocol to approach a homeless veteran, of Emily standing there in her worn military jacket, of Mark Trump reuniting with the medic who had saved his life. It was the kind of story that transcended politics, that struck a chord in people's hearts. Veterans from all over the country shared their own experiences, some praising the moment as a long overdue acknowledgement of the struggles former service members faced, others pointing out the deep flaws in the system that had let someone like Emily fall through the cracks in the first place. But the conversation had begun, and that was what mattered. For the first time in years, Emily's name meant something again, not as a casualty of a broken system, but as a symbol of resilience. News anchors recounted her service, her awards for valor, and the tragic turn that had led her from the battlefield to the streets. Experts debated the implications of her story, questioning how a decorated combat medic could be left without resources, forced to navigate the bureaucratic maze of the VA while struggling with PTSD. Her past was scrutinized, every detail of her military service examined, and yet nothing could change the core truth. Emily Martinez had once saved lives, and now she was about to do it again, just in a different way. The Angel Watch Veterans Foundation, which had already been gaining momentum, saw an explosion of public interest. Donations poured in from people across the country, moved by the story and eager to contribute. Companies pledged to provide jobs for struggling veterans, hospitals reached out with offers to assist in medical programs, and organizations specializing in PTSD treatment volunteered their resources. What had started as Mark Trump's personal mission was now evolving into a national movement, and Emily was at the center of it. But perhaps the most profound impact was felt in the veteran community itself. Homeless veterans who had resigned themselves to life on the streets saw a glimmer of hope in Emily's story. If someone like her, a woman who had once been at the top of her field, a decorated soldier, a person who had been through the same battles they had, could find her way back, then maybe they could too. Shelters reported an increase in veterans seeking help, hotlines for mental health services saw a spike in calls, and social workers noted a renewed willingness among many struggling former soldiers to re-engage with programs they had long since given up on. Emily, now thrust into the national spotlight, faced a whirlwind of interviews, speeches, and policy discussions. She was no politician, and she had no desire to become one, but she did know one thing. If people were listening, she was going to make sure they heard the truth. She spoke openly about her struggles, about the failures of the system, about the stigma that kept so many veterans from seeking help. She told her story, raw and unfiltered, refusing to let anyone turn it into a sanitized narrative. One particular interview with a major news network became an instant classic. The reporter, clearly moved by Emily's honesty, asked, "What do you say to the people who look at you and see a symbol of what's wrong with this country? The idea that someone who served so honorably could end up forgotten?" Emily took a long moment before responding. "I say they're right," she said simply. "This should never have happened, not to me, not to anyone. And I don't want sympathy. I want solutions." Her words resonated in a way that few expected. Even members of Congress took notice, suddenly eager to discuss veterans' issues in a way they hadn't before. Proposals that had once been stalled in legislative limbo were brought back into the conversation. The pressure was on, and the American people were watching. Meanwhile, Emily adjusted to her new reality. She was no longer invisible, no longer just another person on a street corner. She had a place, a purpose, and most importantly, a mission that mattered. The long road she had traveled, from the battlefields of Afghanistan to the cold sidewalks of New York, had led her here, not just to reclaim her own life, but to change the lives of others. And so what began as a chance encounter on a winter morning became something far greater. It became a movement. The story of Emily Martinez was more than just a chance encounter between a former president and a homeless veteran. It was a reflection of a much larger truth about service, sacrifice, and the reality that many who give everything for their country often find themselves abandoned when they need help the most. Her journey from the battlefield to the streets and back into the national spotlight was not just a personal redemption story, but a symbol of the struggles that countless veterans face daily. It forced America to confront uncomfortable questions. How does a nation that prides itself on supporting its military allow so many of its heroes to slip through the cracks? How do individuals who once stood on the front lines in defense of their country find themselves forgotten, left to battle trauma, bureaucracy, and homelessness alone? But beyond the tragedy of her circumstances, Emily's story was also one of resilience. It proved that no matter how far someone falls, there is always a way back, and that second chances are not just possible, they are necessary. Her reunion with Mark Trump was not just a personal moment of closure, but a testament to the deep, often unseen bonds between those who have served. The fact that she had unknowingly saved someone connected to one of the most powerful families in the country was not a coincidence. It was a reminder that the impact of a single act of service can ripple far beyond what anyone could ever imagine. Her story also highlighted the power of human connection. Before Trump had recognized her, before Mark had finally found the woman who had saved his life, it had been a simple act of kindness. A passerby who saw Emily not as an obstacle or a problem, but as a person. That had set everything in motion. The businesswoman who had handed Emily a card that morning had no idea that she was offering a lifeline not just to one woman, but to an entire movement that would go on to change the way the country viewed its veterans. It was proof that sometimes the smallest gestures could have the biggest consequences. At its core, Emily's story reminded people of what true service meant. It was not just about wearing a uniform or fighting on foreign soil. It was about never stopping, about continuing to serve in whatever way possible, even when the battlefield changed. Emily had spent years helping others on the streets, sharing what little she had, guiding fellow veterans to shelters, refusing to turn her back on those who had also been left behind. Even when she had nothing, she had still found a way to give, and that, more than anything, was why people rallied behind her. Her story became a call to action. It was no longer just about fixing one woman's life. It was about fixing a broken system, about ensuring that no other veteran had to walk the same path she had. The media coverage, the political debates, the outpouring of support for the Angel Watch Veterans Foundation, it all stemmed from one undeniable truth. America could not continue to ignore its veterans. They had given everything for their country. It was time for their country to give something back. The story of Emily Martinez is not just about one veteran's struggles and redemption. It carries a deeper lesson about resilience, compassion, and the power of second chances. Values that resonate with all of us, especially those who have lived through life's many trials. As we grow older, we realize that life is unpredictable, filled with moments of both triumph and hardship. We have all faced times when we felt overlooked, when our contributions seemed forgotten, or when we had to start over. But Emily's journey reminds us that our past does not define us. Our ability to keep moving forward does. No matter how difficult life becomes, there is always an opportunity to rebuild, to find purpose, and to make a difference. Her story also emphasizes the importance of recognizing and supporting those in need. In our fast-paced world, it is easy to look past the struggles of others, to assume that someone else will step in to help. But as we saw with Emily, sometimes all it takes is one act of kindness, a simple conversation, a helping hand, or even just acknowledging someone's humanity to set a life-changing series of events into motion. For those of us who have lived long enough to understand the value of community and connection, this is a reminder that we still have the power to shape the world around us, to inspire the younger generations by showing them what it means to care, to serve, and to lift others up. Finally, Emily's story teaches us that service does not end when a uniform is taken off. Whether in our families, communities, or society as a whole, we all have a role to play in making the world a better place. Helping others, sharing wisdom, and standing up for what is right are things we can do at any age. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is that no matter where we are in life, we are never too old, too lost, or too broken to make a difference. On a cold New York morning in 2025, the streets were just beginning to stir. The first waves of commuters rushing past Trump Tower, coffee cups in hand, eyes glued to their phones, barely registering their surroundings. Among the many forgotten faces on the streets, one woman sat near a heating vent, wrapped in a tattered military jacket, her expression both weary and alert, her eyes constantly scanning the area like a soldier still on duty. She was Emily Martinez, a former combat medic who had once served with distinction in Afghanistan, a woman who had saved lives on the battlefield only to be left behind in her own country, now reduced to seeking warmth from a sidewalk vent. Across the street, cameras flashed, reporters murmured, and security personnel stiffened as Donald Trump emerged from the golden entrance of Trump Tower. The former president was scheduled for a high-stakes business meeting, and as always, the press was eager to catch any moment they could spin into headlines. Yet, as he stepped out onto the pavement, something caught his eye. A figure he recognized but couldn't quite place. His security detail anticipated his next move before he even spoke. "Sir, we should get you to the car," one of them murmured, but Trump wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on the woman across the street. A flicker of memory stirred. Something about the face, the way she sat, the insignia on her jacket. He had seen that face before, but where? Without a word, he stepped off the curb, breaking away from the carefully orchestrated security formation. The moment he did, the media scrambled. Cameras adjusted, microphones extended, and within seconds, social media erupted with speculation. "Where's he going?" a reporter muttered. "Is this staged?" another whispered. But Trump wasn't heading toward a rally or an investor. He was walking toward Emily. She noticed the shift immediately. The way the guards repositioned, the way the murmurs of the crowd changed, the sudden movement in her peripheral vision. Old instincts kicked in, honed from years of training and survival. She tensed, ready for anything, even as her mind struggled to process the reality of what was happening. She had spent years being invisible. Now one of the most recognizable figures in the world was heading straight for her. Emily's fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack, her heartbeat quickening. She had faced combat. She had run through gunfire, treated wounded soldiers under mortar fire, and survived horrors that still haunted her. But this was something else entirely. Trump reached her, stopping just a few feet away. He studied her face for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze dropped to the patches still visible on her worn jacket, the combat medic insignia, the faded emblem of her old unit. Recognition dawned in his eyes. "Afghanistan?" he asked. His voice was quieter than she expected, lacking its usual performative bravado. Emily hesitated. She wasn't sure what game was being played here, but she had learned long ago to measure her words carefully. "Yes, sir. 2 tours," she said, her voice steady despite the confusion swirling inside her, a flicker of something. Respect, maybe even guilt, crossed Trump's face. The press was already pressing forward, cameras flashing relentlessly, microphones thrust forward, desperate to capture whatever was unfolding between them. One journalist shouted, "Mr. Trump, do you know this woman?" Another called out, "Is this a publicity stunt?" Emily braced herself. She had been used as a prop before, by the government, by the media, by well-meaning charities that paraded veterans around for fundraising but never followed through with real help. If this was just another performance, she was ready to walk away. But then Trump did something no one expected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, slightly worn at the edges. He held it up, just enough for her to see. It was an old military image, a combat medic in Afghanistan, and next to the medic, barely visible, was a young soldier covered in blood but clinging to consciousness. Emily's stomach dropped. She knew that photo. She had lived it. That was her. And the soldier next to her. Her mind raced, trying to place him. The memories of that day came rushing back. The burning Humvee, the screaming, the unbearable heat of fire licking at her skin as she fought to stabilize the wounded soldier. "You saved my nephew's life," Trump said, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. Emily's breath caught. "What?" "Mark," Trump clarified. 3 years ago, outside Kandahar, he said a medic sang to him while keeping him alive until the medevac arrived. Emily felt like the world was tilting beneath her. Mark. The young soldier she had pulled from that burning wreckage. The one she had fought to keep alive. The one she had sung to, her mother's old Spanish lullaby, to keep him conscious. She had spent years wondering what had happened to him, if he had survived. And now, here was his uncle, standing before her, telling her that not only had Mark lived, but he had been looking for her ever since. Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. The street noise faded, the flashing cameras blurred. For the first time in years, she felt something break through the numbness that had settled over her life. "He's been searching for you," Trump continued, "and so have I." The security detail was restless now, the press in a frenzy, but neither Trump nor Emily moved. The weight of the moment was too heavy, too real. "Come inside," Trump said finally. "Let's talk." Emily hesitated, glancing back at her makeshift corner, the heating vent, the cardboard, the worn-out sleeping bag that had been her home for longer than she cared to admit. She had spent so long surviving that she had forgotten what it felt like to hope. But as she looked back at Trump, at the photo still clutched in his hand, at the undeniable truth in his eyes, she realized this wasn't just another empty gesture. It was a door, and for the first time in a long time, she considered stepping through it. Without another word, she nodded, and with that, the cameras captured the moment that would soon flood every screen across America. The homeless veteran and the former president, the forgotten soldier and the man who refused to forget. And neither of them knew yet just how much this encounter was about to change everything. Emily Martinez had once been a name that commanded respect, a name spoken with admiration in military circles, in trauma units, and among the soldiers whose lives she had saved on the battlefield. But now, in the bustling streets of New York City, she was just another forgotten figure, a homeless veteran reduced to a statistic in a system that had failed her. Wrapped in a tattered military jacket that bore the insignia of her former unit, she sat near a heating vent outside Trump Tower, unnoticed by the hundreds of people who walked past her every day. No one saw the hero she had been. No one saw the sacrifices she had made. No one saw Emily Martinez. But that was about to change. Born and raised in Philadelphia, Emily had always known she wanted to serve. Her father had been a police officer, her mother a nurse, and from a young age she had been instilled with the values of duty, honor, and sacrifice. She was the kind of person who ran toward danger instead of away from it, the kind of person who refused to let fear dictate her actions. That drive led her to the military, where she enlisted straight out of high school, determined to make a difference. She became a combat medic, one of the best in her unit, known for her steady hands and sharp mind, capable of keeping a cool head even in the most chaotic of battlefields. In Afghanistan, she had been the lifeline for countless soldiers, running through gunfire to treat the wounded, stabilizing them under impossible conditions, making life or death decisions in mere seconds. It was in those moments that Emily truly felt a sense of purpose, knowing that her hands, her knowledge, and her courage were the only things standing between a fellow soldier and death. Her reputation grew quickly. Emily wasn't just a medic. She was a force of nature. She could stitch up a wound under fire, administer emergency procedures with nothing more than her bare hands and sheer determination, and lift the spirits of her unit with her relentless optimism. Even in the face of war's brutality, she had a way of making people believe they would make it home. And yet, for all her bravery, for all the lives she saved, there was one day that would change everything. One day that would haunt her long after the war was over. It had started like any other mission, a routine patrol outside Kandahar. The air was thick with dust, the sun an unrelenting force overhead. Emily had been in the second Humvee, her medical kit secured to her back, scanning the road ahead for anything that seemed off. Then, without warning, the world exploded. An IED. The lead vehicle was hit first, flipping in a violent eruption of fire and shrapnel. The blast threw her Humvee off balance, sending it skidding sideways, the force rattling through her bones. The screams came next. "Man down! We need a medic!" Instinct took over. Despite the ringing in her ears, despite the chaos, Emily grabbed her bag and ran toward the wreckage. The vehicle was already engulfed in flames, the smell of burning metal and flesh filling the air. She didn't hesitate. She crawled inside, ignoring the heat, ignoring the panic clawing at her mind. That was when she found him. Private Mark Trump. Barely conscious, his uniform soaked in blood, his breathing ragged. His eyes met hers, full of pain, but also trust. He was scared, but he wasn't alone. Emily worked fast, assessing his injuries, stabilizing him as best as she could. His wounds were severe, but he had a chance. Still, the flames were spreading and time was running out. The vehicle groaned under the heat, metal warping, threatening to collapse around them. Emily's heart pounded as she fought to drag him out. "Stay with me," she ordered, refusing to let him slip away. "That's an order, soldier." But she could see it in his face, the pain, the exhaustion, the temptation to let go. She had seen it before, and she knew what she had to do. She started singing. A lullaby, soft and steady, the same one her mother had sung to her as a child when she was scared. "Mi pequeño angel," she whispered, keeping her voice calm, keeping him focused on her instead of the agony ripping through his body. She didn't stop, not even when the heat became unbearable, not even when her own body begged her to run. And then, just as the flames reached them, hands pulled them both away. Other soldiers, the medevac team. They made it. Mark survived, and Emily, for all her injuries, for all the trauma she endured that day, had never allowed herself to wonder what happened to him after that. She had been sent home, medically discharged, after an infection set in from the wounds she had sustained. The war had taken everything from her. Her career, her purpose, her ability to sleep without hearing the screams of the battlefield. She had tried to go back to her old life. but it didn't fit anymore. The PTSD was relentless. She tried therapy, but the VA had wait lists months long. She tried going back to medicine, but the panic attacks made it impossible. She had family, once, friends. But when the nightmares became too much, when she withdrew into herself, they didn't understand. She lost her job, she lost her home, and eventually, she lost herself. Now, sitting outside Trump Tower, she barely resembled the woman she had once been. She was just another forgotten soldier. Another veteran lost in the cracks of a system that claimed to honor service, but failed to support it. And yet, in an instant, everything changed, because Donald Trump had seen her. He had recognized something that no one else had, and as he stood before her, holding that photograph of the soldier she had saved, looking at her with something like gratitude in his eyes, Emily realized that, for the first time in years, someone remembered. Someone knew what she had done. Someone had been looking for her. And suddenly, the woman who had spent so long being invisible was the center of the world's attention. The energy in the air shifted as the crowd outside Trump Tower thickened. What had started as a routine security formation for the former president had now turned into a full-fledged media frenzy. Reporters whispered into microphones, camera operators jostled for position, and bystanders pulled out their phones, recording the scene unfolding before them. At the center of it all, standing apart from the well-dressed professionals, tourists, and journalists, was Emily Martinez, her worn military jacket clashing with the polished world around her. She had spent years mastering the art of blending in, of becoming invisible, but now, for reasons she didn't fully understand, all eyes were on her. And at the center of the commotion, Donald Trump was making a decision that would change everything. His security team had been expecting a simple business meeting, a quiet morning, and an uneventful entrance into Trump Tower. This wasn't in the plan. They had seen him ignore protocol before, seen him throw away carefully coordinated schedules for the sake of instinct, but this was different. There was something in the way he looked at Emily, something unspoken but deeply personal. He wasn't just seeing a homeless veteran on the street. He was seeing a debt that had to be repaid. "Sir, we need to keep moving," one of his security officers murmured through his earpiece, stepping closer. The crowd was getting louder and the press was beginning to shout questions. Trump's head of security, a veteran of countless high-pressure situations, shifted uneasily. This was not a controlled environment. But Trump wasn't moving. He was studying Emily, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The faded insignia on her jacket, the military patches worn thin from years of exposure, the way she stood despite the cold, despite everything. She didn't cower. "Mr. President?" the security chief prompted again. Still, Trump didn't respond. He reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against the edge of an old photograph. A military image. He pulled it out, glancing down at it for only a moment before holding it up slightly, enough for Emily to see. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that picture. It was an old combat photograph taken outside Kandahar. In it, she could see the remnants of her old unit, could see herself, standing beside the wounded soldiers she had helped that day. But what struck her wasn't the familiarity of the image. It was the realization of who had been carrying it all this time. Trump followed her gaze, watching as recognition flickered across her face. "You remember this?" he asked, his voice lower now, almost quiet. Emily swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She nodded. "You saved him," Trump said, his voice steady, certain. "My nephew." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The reporters sensed something bigger, something personal in the former president's tone. The cameras zoomed in, catching every movement, every flicker of emotion on Emily's face. She blinked, trying to process what she was hearing. "Your nephew..." The words barely escaped her lips. The young soldier, the one she had dragged out of the burning Humvee, the one she had kept alive with nothing but her hands, her training, and an old Spanish lullaby, that was Donald Trump's nephew? Everything around her seemed to slow down. Trump exhaled, his grip tightening slightly on the photograph. "He's been looking for you," he continued, "for years." Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. She had never expected this. The press was going wild now, but Trump ignored them. He made his decision right then and there. Without hesitation, he broke away from his security detail. "Sir, wait," one of his agents protested, but it was already too late. Trump took a step forward directly toward Emily. The crowd gasped. The security team scrambled to adjust, moving into position, trying to regain control, but Trump was focused only on Emily. He gestured toward the entrance of Trump Tower, his expression firm. "Come inside," he said. Emily didn't move. She was still trying to process the sheer weight of what was happening, still trying to piece together how this one moment had unraveled years of being invisible. "Come inside," Trump repeated, his voice unwavering. "Let's talk." The noise around them faded, the questions from the press momentarily drowned out by the weight of the moment. Trump wasn't making a spectacle of this. He wasn't turning it into a campaign moment or a media stunt. He was making a personal decision, one that carried the weight of gratitude, of responsibility, of honor. Emily glanced at the crowd, at the dozens, no, hundreds of people watching, waiting, filming. She knew what this would look like, knew how quickly people would twist it. But she also knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't about politics. It was about something much bigger. She took a breath, her fingers brushing the edge of her dog tags beneath her jacket. She had made harder decisions before. She had walked through fire before. And now she took the first step toward an unknown future. She followed him inside. The memory of that day in Afghanistan never faded. It was burned into Emily Martinez's mind as vividly as the scorching sun over Kandahar. The sand had been thick in the air, carried by a wind that whispered warnings before the explosion. It had been a routine patrol, or at least it was supposed to be. Emily had done this 100 times before, moving with her unit, scanning for threats, staying alert to every shift in the landscape. As a combat medic, she had seen enough injuries, enough pain, to know that peace was always an illusion in war. But nothing, not the training, not the drills, not the years of preparation, could have readied her for what was about to happen. She remembered the sound first, the deafening roar of metal twisting, of fire erupting from the vehicle ahead. The Humvee in front of them lifted off the ground in a violent, unnatural movement, its entire undercarriage torn apart by the force of an IED. The explosion sent a shockwave through the convoy, the impact rattling Emily's own vehicle as dust and shrapnel filled the air. The radio crackled with urgent voices, shouting orders, demanding status reports. But Emily was already moving before her mind had even caught up with her body. There was no time to think, only time to act. She grabbed her medical bag and sprinted forward, her boots kicking up sand, her breath sharp and steady. She could hear gunfire now, rounds snapping through the air from an unseen enemy, echoing across the valley. Someone screamed for a medic. That was all she needed. She ran toward the flames. The Humvee was a wreck of burning steel and shattered glass. The front of the vehicle was nearly unrecognizable, its armor warped, its windows blown out. Smoke choked the air, thick and acrid, but through it, Emily saw movement. A soldier pinned inside, struggling, his voice barely rising over the chaos. Blood streaked his face, his uniform, his hands reaching for something, for someone. Emily didn't hesitate. She climbed onto the wreckage, ignoring the searing heat against her gear, and forced her way inside. The soldier was trapped, his leg pinned beneath the crumpled frame, his eyes wide with panic. "I got you," she said, her voice steady, controlled. She needed to keep him calm, needed him to believe that she was in control. "Stay with me, soldier." He was young, so young, too young to die out here in the middle of nowhere, far from home. She could see the pain in his eyes, the fear beneath it. He was slipping, his breathing ragged, his hands shaking. Then she heard it. A second explosion in the distance, more gunfire, the battle intensifying. The unit was engaging, returning fire, but Emily had one mission: get him out alive. She worked quickly, assessing his injuries, her hands moving on instinct, wrapping a tourniquet around his shattered leg, checking for additional wounds. The adrenaline dulled the reality of the situation, drowned out the fear clawing at the edges of her mind. Focus. Keep him alive. But she saw it, the way his eyelids flickered, the way his body was starting to go limp. He was losing too much blood. He wasn't going to make it unless she kept him conscious. And so she did the only thing she could think of. She sang. A soft, steady melody, a lullaby her mother used to sing to her when she was little. A Spanish lullaby that had once soothed her in the darkest nights of her childhood. Duerme, duerme, mi pequeño ángel. The soldier's eyes fluttered open. He blinked, barely focusing, but she could see it. The fight returning, the spark of survival. "That's it," she murmured, her hands still working, her voice unwavering. "Stay with me." It felt like an eternity before the rest of the unit reached them, before more hands helped pry the wreckage off of him, before the medevac chopper finally arrived. Even then, she had refused to let go. She stayed with him, holding pressure on his wounds, holding his hand, holding on to hope. And then, for 9 consecutive months, she was lugged back to Troy. She stayed with him, holding pressure on his head all night, leaving no room for CAN-4 and CAN. Flashlight. She hadn't realized she'd been injured too. She had felt the heat, had smelled the blood, but she had been so focused on saving him that she hadn't noticed the shrapnel lodged in her own back, the slow bleed weakening her body. By the time they reached the field hospital, her vision had blurred, her strength had drained, and she had blacked out. When she woke up, she was stateside, discharged. They sent her home before she could even find out what happened to the soldiers she had saved, before she could even learn his name. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of wondering, 3 years of nightmares, 3 years of trying to forget while never truly letting go. And now, Donald Trump was standing in front of her, telling her that the young soldier had lived, that he had been looking for her ever since. Emily swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the edges of her military jacket. The past was no longer just a memory. It was standing right in front of her, waiting for her to step forward. Donald Trump had always prided himself on his memory, on the ability to recall faces, names, events from years past with near-perfect clarity. It was a skill that had served him well in business, in politics, in life. But as he stood there, looking into the weathered, battle-hardened face of the homeless woman before him, something shifted in his mind, a puzzle piece snapping into place, a memory that had been lingering in the background, just out of reach. He knew this woman, not from a business deal, not from politics, but from a conversation that had haunted him for years, his nephew, Mark. 3 years ago, Mark had come back from Afghanistan changed. Trump had seen it before in other veterans, how war stole something from them, something intangible yet undeniable. Mark had been full of life before deployment, full of confidence, ambition, but when he returned there was a distance in his eyes, a weight in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. Trump had tried to reach him, to offer help, but Mark had only ever talked about one thing: the medic who had saved his life. "She kept me alive," Mark had said one night over dinner, his voice quiet, haunted. "I was pinned in a burning Humvee. I was slipping in and out, and she sang to me. A Spanish lullaby. She wouldn't let me go." Trump had listened, had nodded, had asked for details, but Mark had never known her name. The battlefield had been chaos. Medevac had taken him before he could even get a proper look at her face. She was just a voice, a presence, a pair of hands that had worked tirelessly to keep him breathing. Over the years, Mark had tried to find her. Trump had even offered resources, military contacts, record searches, but the name never surfaced. The medic had disappeared. And now, here she was, the woman standing before him, Emily Martinez. At first, he had simply noticed the jacket, the insignia. He had recognized the way she carried herself, even in the way she stood, alert, calculating, always assessing her surroundings like a soldier who had never truly left the battlefield. But it was the eyes that convinced him. Those were the eyes Mark had described, the ones that had burned into his memory during those desperate moments of pain and fear. Trump felt his heart pound as realization settled over him like a storm. This wasn't just a chance encounter. This wasn't just another veteran in need. This was the woman who had saved his nephew's life. And she had no idea. His security team shifted uneasily around him, waiting for direction, for some explanation as to why the former president of the United States was standing still, staring at a homeless veteran like he'd just seen a ghost. The crowd outside was still growing, the cameras still flashing, but in that moment, none of it mattered. "Your jacket," Trump finally said, his voice quieter than usual but firm. "It's from Afghanistan." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, wary. "Yes, sir. What unit?" 45th Combat Support Hospital. The answer hit him like a gut punch. Mark had told him that too. Trump took a slow breath, trying to steady himself. This was real. After all these years, after all the searching, he had found her. No, she had found him. Emily's hand instinctively gripped the strap of her backpack, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Something wrong, sir?" Trump studied her face, his mind racing. Should he tell her now? Should he wait until Mark was here? Would she even believe him? Then, without another word, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a photograph. It was worn at the edges, slightly bent, an old military image, one he had seen 100 times before. A photo of a young soldier standing with his unit, arms draped over his comrades, grinning in the desert sun. He held it out to her. "Do you recognize him?" Emily frowned slightly but took the photograph, glancing down. At first there was nothing, just another soldier, just another face among the thousands she had seen over her years of service. And then her breath caught. Her grip on the photo tightened as her mind dragged her backward in time, back to the searing heat of Afghanistan, back to the sounds of gunfire and explosions, back to the burning Humvee, back to a pair of desperate eyes staring up at her as she worked to keep him alive. "Mark?" Her throat tightened, her pulse quickened. It couldn't be. "This?" Her voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "This is him?" Trump nodded slowly. "Yes. My nephew." Emily's vision blurred for a moment, the weight of it all crashing down on her. The soldier she had saved, the one she had wondered about for years, the one she thought she would never know the fate of. He had lived. He had made it, and now she was standing face to face with his family. Trump saw the emotion flicker across her face, the disbelief, the shock, the flood of memories she had tried to bury. And in that moment, he knew without a doubt. Emily Martinez wasn't just a forgotten war hero. She was the reason his nephew was still alive.